Central to the responsibility of all public intellectuals who value freedom is to provide a robust and detailed refutation of all the socio-political developments which arise to threaten human rights and personal liberty. Where many will dismiss a restriction on freedom as being minute, distant, or unimportant, it is crucial that those with a working knowledge of history, philosophy, and politics identify the cracks in the foundations of structures put in place to uphold freedom, and offer a response that closes the gaps created by those who seek to undermine the way of life we hold dear. Such is the case with the looming Icelandic porn ban, which will restrict the sale of pornography on the internet, joining existing laws that ban prostitution and stripping in that country, as well as generally unenforced laws about pornography in print. The charge has been led by Interior Minister Ögmundur Jónasson, and his justifications merit considerable scrutiny. We have to be able to discuss a ban on violent pornography, which we all agree has a very harmful effect on young people and can have a clear link to incidences of violent crime, he is reported saying in the Telegraph. Later in the article, Mr. Jónasson's political advisor, Hella Gunnarsdóttir, said, quote, "There is a strong consensus building in Iceland. We have so many experts from educationalists to the police and those who work with children behind this that this has become much broader than party politics." Close quote. The Telegraph goes on to report that Iceland will join China in banning porn. If all of this rhetoric sounds familiar, it should. Just consider the words of one of the ban's leading advocates and expert witnesses. Quote, "Iceland is taking a very progressive approach that no other democratic country has tried. It is looking at pornography from a new position, from the perspective of the harm it does to the women who appear in it and as a violation of their civil rights." Close quote. And who would say such a thing? My regular viewers should already know. Yes, that's right. Comrade Dines has been the central figure in advocating for the Icelandic porn ban. She was invited out to speak to the Icelandic government, and, in absence of testimony from anyone in support of pornography, they have treated her lies and propaganda as genuine academia and formed legislation around it. Gail has even been calling, though apparently tongue-in-cheek, for feminists to patriate en masse to Iceland. This is amusing because she seems to think that Iceland will be some sort of femme-centric utopia simply because it's banning porn. Well, you may have noticed that in Iceland every man's surname ends with son and every woman's surname ends with dóttir. This is because there are no familial surnames in Iceland. Your last name is simply the possessive form of your father's name followed by son or dóttir. So if your father was Jacob, then you'd be Jacobson if you're a boy, and Jacobsdóttir if you're a girl. Surely the idea of your name being determined entirely by the possessive relationship of a patriarch wouldn't sit well with the uber-PC reactionaries in the radical feminist camp. In other words, you might want to look deeper into Icelandic culture before you pack your bags. The greatest travesty, however, in the course of the Icelandic porn ban process is not the negation of personal liberties, but Iceland's attempt to pass itself off not as an authoritarian censor, but as a champion of liberty-enthroned progressives. No initiative towards authoritarian control begins with a declaration of the intent to oppress. They begin, time and again, with the intent to do what is best for the people in the interest of the collective. Ask yourself, would you be in favor of a government that made sure jobs were provided for all of its citizens? Would you be in favor of a government that made sure certain wealthy individuals weren't able to fill the press and airwaves with views that help maintain their ethnocentric control of the media? Would you be in favor of a government that redistributed the wealth of large corporations, created a strong middle class, made war profiteering a crime, made post-secondary education available to all citizens, and established universal health care with a special emphasis on women and children? What about a society that, above all, has a motto of public interest before private interest? Does that sound like the kind of progressive, forward-thinking society you would want to be a part of? Well, then you'll be interested to know that all of those ideas were taken directly from the party platform of the National Socialist German Workers' Party. This is not to suggest that those who attempt to effect positive social change are always doing so with the intent of establishing an oppressive dictatorship. It is, however, meant to underscore the basic truth that those who attempt to establish a dictatorship do so not by telling the masses that their support will lead to a police state that prosecutes thought crimes without due process, slaughters millions, and locks up more in concentration camps. That would not win over many supporters in a democratic, educated, prosperous first world country. The method that the mystics of muscle use to win support is to present a scenario in which a propagandized evil has reached such a horrific point that only decisive legislative action can make us safe again.
The Minister of Welfare in Iceland, Guðbjartur Hannesson, thinks it's not right to fight this with legislation, that we need to, well, question our own decency and, well, rely on a change of thought. But is it possible to step on the brakes in that way?
Well, I would say you absolutely need to change the way people think about it. But I would argue that this has gotten so big and so enormous, and we're at such a crisis level, that you need a kind of public health approach. So one would be certainly education and changing the way people think, but I would absolutely argue for legislation as well. I mean, you know, if you want to stop this, then you have to figure out a way for Icelandic men not to have access to hardcore pornography. If you really want women and girls to have gender equality in Iceland, then you cannot be basically feeding your boys and men a steady diet of pornography. The two don't go together. So I would agree, yes, you need to change thought, but you need to think about legislative activity as well.
Comrade Dines has time and again denied being in favor of banning porn, but not for the reason of being a champion of freedom. Observe her response to the backlash of her revealing her key role in the Icelandic porn ban. Quote, "For everyone screaming that I believe in censorship because I support the Icelandic proposal to ban porn, let me make something very clear. Do I believe that most governments in the world should decide what we can and can't read, view, masturbate to, etc.? No, I do not. The reason is that they are corrupt and held hostage by corporations. However, I do believe that a democratic country that has a government that has shown itself to work for the people rather than corporate interests has a compelling interest in protecting its citizens from harmful corporate speech. If the government does not protect us from global corporations, then as individual citizens we are powerless in the face of their enormous economic, cultural, and political power. The goal of the FDA and the FCC and other such government bodies was to protect us from corporations. It was understood right here in the USA that we need someone bigger than ourselves to protect us from predatory capitalists. Of course, these organizations are now largely run by people who bow and scrape to corporate interests. But this is America, not Iceland. So people, try to get your head around this. America is not the only country in the world, so what holds true here does not hold true for all other countries." Close quote. First and foremost, I should address the matter of suggesting that the government has the responsibility of protecting the people from harmful corporate speech. The government does not protect citizens from speech. We have freedom of the press in this country, and whether Gail wishes to acknowledge it or not, those corporations are made up of citizens of this country that also have protection under the Constitution. But more so than that brazen declaration that the United States government has a responsibility to do what it has declared first and foremost it will not do, it is crucial to address the reason that Gail is opposed to censorship. She starts out by saying that this will address accusations that she believes in censorship, but then declares that she has one set of beliefs about censorship for one country and a different set for another, as if to suggest that her principles are not based on an overarching philosophy, but rather on pragmatism, something she decries capitalists for doing. I am opposed to censorship regardless of the country, but that is because I am truly, deeply committed to the concept of freedom of speech, and as such I cannot accept a government that censors, whether it is in the US or Iceland or Afghanistan or any other country in the world. But Gail can maintain this dichotomy because the root of her opposition to censorship in America is not a support for freedom, but rather the belief that America, as it now stands, will not be the type of dictatorship she approves of. Her concern is not that Americans be free, but that they be oppressed by her allies rather than her enemies. This is known as the argument from depravity, the idea that a society has freedom not because it is the fundamental right of every human being, but because the society is not good enough for a dictatorship. Comrade Dines saying that her brand of censorship is morally superior to what she thinks would be the alternative is like thyroid cancer trying to argue that it is morally superior to pancreatic cancer. Dines was quick to remove the aforementioned Facebook post and replace it with a new article she wrote for Counterpunch. The beginning of the article is needless exposition about lobbyists, but then she gets to the meat of her argument. Quote, "So what a shock it was to be looking into the eyes of so many politicians in Reykjavik. Yes, Iceland is a small country and is way more homogeneous than the United States, but for all that, I still did not expect to have conversations with ministers who spoke about the harms of unregulated capitalism, that we need to protect the civil rights of women and children against a predatory porn industry, and the rights of women and children to live free from fear of sexual violence." I want to address the concept right quick of the idea of freedom from. That is a very, very crucial concept to bring into consideration because it has much more significant implications than what they're giving it. And I actually address the concept of freedom from in my novel Eros Empire. If you want to join me on page 292, my character Isaac Alston is giving a speech, and during the course of it, he says this. "The radical feminists have proposed nobly to remove rape from society, but they have failed to understand that the nature of the requisite freedom is not to be free from rape, but to be free to live without rape. Being free from something is a logically flawed notion. Being free from means a person must only be removed from the possible threat to be considered free. By this logic, a prisoner in solitary confinement is free from the outdoor elements, physical harm, emotional betrayal, communicable illness, and nearly any other potential threat. This is the implication to live free from rape, and it is only a backdoor into the enslavement of women that the sex negative in our species have always sought. To be free from rape simply requires that sex, the circumstance of rape, be made impossible." On my first night there, I had dinner with Ögmundur Jónasson, Iceland's Minister of the Interior, who also happens to be a leading member of the left-green movement. The fact that someone from such a party would have any political power was my too long in America moment. But if that weren't enough, his views on feminism, equality, and gender justice were just too much for my jet-lagged brain. Here was a politician who was unapologetically opposed to porn because it undermines women's equality, and equally bold in his willingness to create legislation that limits Icelandic men and boys' access to hardcore, cruel porn. He said this at dinner, repeated it 2 days later at a public conference on pornography and the law, and is saying it again in his efforts to draft a law that will be the first of its type anywhere in the world. Never before has a country tried to limit porn because it is seen as a violation of women and children's civil rights. But then, can you expect anything less of a country that was the first to ban stripping on the basis that it promotes gender inequality? I should first stop to emphasize that while Gail is notorious for lying about what other people have told her and unable to reproduce what they tell her accurately or accountably, in this case there are plenty of examples, see the articles provided, of Icelandic politicians and representatives expressing these same convictions. Those who have balked at my advocacy in the past and asserted that such ridiculous ideas could never catch on in any meaningful way should take note. This is a modern first world government that is not only in staunch agreement with Dines, but actively seeking out her guidance. She goes on to say, quote, As the news started to leak out here in the US, some criticized Iceland for entertaining censorship, but the issue is more complex. In the 2012 election campaign, Mitt Romney famously stated that corporations are people, but corporate speech doesn't deserve the same protections as individual expression. And in Europe, there is less tolerance for hate speech that impinges on the rights of minorities to live free from fear and violence. In Iceland, people understand that people are not corporations and that the government serves to protect rights rather than threaten them. Close quote. This is completely illogical. By what right does corporate speech not deserve the same protection as individual expression? I'll let the good folks at Learn Liberty explain the actual and immensely logical purpose of corporate personhood.
Should the government be able to ban books and movies? Well, the United States government says yes. At least it did in Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission. Now, you've probably heard of Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission. It's the case in which the Supreme Court says that corporations are just like people and should be able to spend as much money as they want on politics. But the government's position in that case was that if a corporation had any role in producing or distributing a book or a movie, say Barnes & Noble selling a book, or Disney Pixar or MGM making a movie, the government could ban it if it contained even one line of political advocacy. There's a lot more to the case in this idea of corporate personhood than what you might have heard. Corporations are not people, and nobody thinks they are. The Supreme Court doesn't think they are. But corporations have been recognized as persons for purposes of the law for centuries. In the United States, at least since the 1819 Supreme Court decision in Dartmouth College v. Woodward, but really going back quite a bit further into the common law. So if corporations aren't people, what are they? Well, they're not just office buildings or desks or telephones. Corporations consist of, in fact, managers and executives and shareholders. That's really what a corporation is. By treating corporations as people for legal purposes, we create a great many advantages for our society. In fact, imagine if we didn't treat a corporation as a person. How would you sue a corporation? If you wanted to sue Exxon, you'd have to find the millions of different shareholders and sue them all individually. That doesn't sound like a very satisfactory way to run a court system. Having corporations recognized as people for legal purposes allows corporations to buy and sell property without having to retitle the property every time somebody sells their stock. It enables people to pool their resources to create great new products for us. It allows the creation of an Apple that produces iPhones and iPads that we can use. That would probably not happen if you didn't have some mechanism for people to bring all their property together. So the idea of a corporation as a person, as a legal concept, is very valuable to us. Now, do corporations have all the rights of real people? Well, no, of course they don't. But corporations have all the rights that we as people have when we assemble, when we join together. So John can speak, and you have a right to speak, and I have a right to speak, and the three of us have a right to speak together. And we have a right to get a whole bunch of other people to join with us, and we can all go down to City Hall, and we don't lose our rights to the First Amendment, our rights to speak and assemble and petition, simply because we join together and simply because we might organize ourselves as a corporation in order to handle our administrative and management affairs. Think about what would happen if corporations didn't have rights. The government could just seize corporate property and leave the shareholders holding worthless pieces of stock that are of no value whatsoever, and they could do that with no due process and with no just compensation. It could search office buildings of corporations, because if corporations didn't have rights, who would have standing to object when the government came around to do warrantless searches? Corporations don't have rights because they're people, they're not. They have rights because we have rights as people. And we have rights as people even when we join together with other people, and we have rights even when we form corporations. We form corporations to help us do the things we want to do in life, whether it's go into business or hold property together, or even organize a nonprofit like the Sierra Club or the ACLU. So when you say that corporations shouldn't have rights, you're restricting not the rights of some amorphous group or thing that nobody's ever heard of, you're restricting the rights of real people. And when we think about the position that the government took in Citizens United, that the government has the right to ban a book or a movie simply because a corporation had some role in producing or distributing it, I think we should be awfully glad that corporations have rights. And that's something you probably haven't heard about Citizens United.
And to answer the inevitable straw man that corporations, if identified as people, will use their massive wealth to control the media and make endless campaign donations so that their candidates win, I'll remind you of the blatantly obvious fact that no amount of corporate support for the opposition was able to stop Barack Obama from getting elected and re-elected. Your frightened conspiracy theory is not a default fact. Comrade Dines continues saying, quote, "While no socialist utopia, Iceland has a government that has demonstrated a capacity to work for the people rather than just corporate interests, and a government that works for the people has a compelling interest in protecting citizens from harmful corporate practices. Ministers and senior staff I met there understood their role in honoring the integrity of their culture and saw porn as a form of cultural imperialism, since the porn Icelandic men consume is churned out by a small group of producers in Los Angeles. So the question is this: if the government does not protect us from global corporations, then who will, since as individual citizens we are powerless in the face of their enormous economic, cultural, and political power?" I think it's not just the expats who should be asking what we miss by living in the U.S., but in the U.S., Americans should start asking what they are missing out on by living in a country that is run by corporate-owned politicians. What does it mean that many Americans can't even imagine the existence of a government anywhere in the world that might try to do the right thing by its people? If Iceland is successful in limiting access to porn, then it will be able to show all of us how a government can stand up to corporate bullies on the behalf of its people. How amazing this will be for those of us in the U.S. who are still reeling from the misogynist Republican comments that we had to endure during the past election season, to see a government that works on the principle that women's lives do indeed matter, close quote. It is not the role of any government to provide protection to its citizens from corporations. The sole responsibility of the government is to protect its citizens from physical harm and is to serve as a means of resolving legal disputes peacefully. A proper government is only a police and court system that serves to protect its citizens from actions they commit against others. All else is an unacceptable breach of the government's role in a free society. Freedom of speech in a free society is an absolute. It cannot be curtailed in the interest of protecting those who might be upset by it, and this is not nullified by the speech being corporate speech. The citizens of a country, which include those who operate businesses, do not require protection from businesses because businesses cannot use physical force. If a business interest uses physical force through their action or causes a person physical harm, the same laws that would apply to private citizens apply to those responsible for the business as well. No government in a free society has any ability or it has any responsibility nor any right to protect its citizens from the spread of ideas, and the social architects who will stop at nothing to make sure the only thoughts and ideas spread are their own have no moral standing and no right to petition their government for an advancement of their social agenda. It may be tempting to write off what's happening in Iceland as the minor action of a minor country with no real bearing on Western democracy, with only about 320,000 people. But no country operates in a vacuum, and so we must contrast this with certain widespread developments in the United States that make our country vulnerable to the kind of oppression being lauded by Icelandic politicians.
I'm not going to say much. I think everybody else is far better at this than me. I am just here to support the President of the United States. The President of the United States is, our boss. But he's also, the President and the First Lady are kind of like the mom and the dad of the country. And when your dad says something, you listen. And when you don't, it usually bites you in the ass later on. So I'm here to support the President. Thank you. I'm not going to say much. I think everybody else is far better at this than me. I am just here to support the President of the United States. The President of the United States is, you know, our boss, but he's also, you know, the President and the First Lady are kind of like the mom and the dad of the country. And when your dad says something, you listen. And when you don't, it usually bites you in the ass later on. So I'm here to support the President. Thank you.
Everyone I play this clip for dismisses it by saying that Chris Rock is a comedian and his comments can't be taken seriously. This is what Chris Rock sounds like during his comedy act.
And everybody talking about gun control. Gotta get rid of the guns. Fuck that, I like guns. You got a gun, you don't have to work out. I ain't working out. I ain't jogging. You got pecs, I got pecs. Oh, man, shit. You don't need no gun control. You know what you need? We need some bullet control. We need to control the bullets. That's right. I think all bullets should cost $5,000. $5,000 for a bullet. You know why? Because if a bullet costs $5,000, there'll be no more innocent bystanders. Every time somebody gets shot, you be like, damn, he must have did something. Shit, they put $50,000 worth of bullets in his ass. And people will think before they kill somebody if a bullet costs $5,000. Man, I would blow your fucking head off if I could afford it. I'm gonna get me another job, I'm gonna start saving some money, and you a dead man. You better hope I can't get no bullets on layaway. So even if you get shot by a stray bullet, you won't have to go to no doctor to get it taken out. Whoever shot you, take their bullet back. I believe you got my property.
When Chris Rock is trying to be funny, he is loud, brash, and arrogant with no regard for subtlety whatsoever. In this clip, he is hunched over, wide-eyed, and soft-spoken. There is nothing comedic about his delivery. He is dead serious in his belief that the President and First Lady are the parents of the country. This is blatantly untrue, and not even something that can logically be entertained even as a metaphor. Elected officials are paid by the taxpayers. They exist to serve the taxpayers who pay their salaries. Rock's words are the hollow, vacant drivel of one who doesn't understand that a benevolent dictatorship is still a dictatorship. There is a reason that authoritarian countries are referred to with names like the Fatherland and Mother Russia. They are the states in which the authority of the government is so absolute that it is comparable to the authority of a parent to a child. People like Chris Rock, of whom I was formerly a fan, fail to understand the difference between rules and laws. When you are a child, your parents hand down a set of rules by which they expect you to live. You are expected to abide by these rules on the understanding that your parents have your best interest at heart and will never steer you wrong. But more than that, you as a child are incapable of knowing what's in your best interest, and thus that determination is placed in the hands of your parents. The rules are a set of moral and legal absolutes which you, the child, are not to question. Growing up, however, means learning to think for yourself, and as such, you go from being governed by the rules and instead have your actions governed by the law. And the law is not a set of unquestionable absolutes. It is a set of standards that we, as citizens in a free society, agree to uphold so that we can live together in peace. When the laws themselves interrupt our ability to live peacefully, meaning they infringe on our rights, we have the capacity to appeal the laws and eventually overturn them. We are able to do this because the government consists of our representatives, not our parents. But Chris Rock is not alone. As in
the
this
environment care a lot about that. But I've also heard you say that the government needs to force you to recycle. Yeah, I do think that. There are things that, you know, it's the argument that relates to the argument that people make that conservatives make when you say, you know, gosh, we should tax the rich, and they say, well, then why don't you just write a check?
Oh yeah.
You know, well, because it's not enough. You know, if every rich guy was going to do that, great, but it's not going to happen.
Exactly.
That's the government's job, is to you know, like it or not, force us to do things we don't want to do that will ultimately help us all.
And
I'm sure I'll be called a socialist for that last comment.
Conservatives hear that, when they hear the words government needs to...
That's how bridges stay up, right?
Right, that's exactly how bridges stay up.
I normally like Seth MacFarlane. He created one of my favorite TV shows of all time, and I do think he means well in what he is attempting to justify. The problem is not his intent, but the fact that what he is proposing is unjustifiable both morally and logically. It is not the proper role of government to force us to do things we normally wouldn't do, but even more so, how is it that we are incapable of doing what's supposedly right voluntarily, but capable and justified in establishing a government that will force us to do what we already knew was right, but were unwilling to do voluntarily? These examples demonstrate a disturbing trend among the left. For 8 years of the W. Bush administration, the left were the champions of questioning authority, of challenging the rights and privileges taken by the administration, and they were right to do so. George W. Bush and his cabinet are war criminals of the highest order, and the right-wing news pundits now screeching about the loss of our freedoms were, for those 8 years, the submissive cheerleader patriots who bent over backwards to justify the president no matter how wretched he became. The roles have been shifted with this president. The left has made itself into little Boy Scouts who bow to their dad, and I am quite certain that the roles will shift again the next time a Republican is in office. Most disturbing in this current trend of unquestioned loyalty is that as I sit here writing, I am watching the Oscars, and before my very eyes, the First Lady of the United States is appearing on screen to read the winner of the Academy Awards. I am sorry, Michelle, but I do not need you or your husband or any elected official to appear and bestow a benediction on the film industry. There is no reason for a political figure to make that appearance, and it is a very inappropriate bridging of government into private institutions of the arts and humanities that so many on the newly patriotic left fail to grasp. This is not a condemnation of President Obama, not at all. I see him as having his ups and downs as any president, with the exception of the consistently failing W, will have. The problem is that this newfound orgy of left-wing patriotism is exactly what will allow authoritarians like Comrade Dines to fully and completely accomplish their agenda. The government will not take your rights away from you if this trend continues. You will give them up willingly and bow your head to an authority that has no right to rule you and no ability to do so save that which you give it. If such landmark decisions as those that now hang in the balance of the Icelandic Parliament seem alien and far-fetched, consider that Measure B recently passed in California and, predictably, Comrade Dines took a victory lap. After her long-standing assertion that she was genuinely concerned about worker safety with regards to the condom mandate, Dines ran hog wild proclaiming that Measure B was crucial to shutting down the industry, the very ruse she had been accused of running all along. Measure B, a law that for the first time requires private citizens to use condoms under certain circumstances, was not put in place by big corporations. It was the brainchild of a nonprofit president, Michael Weinstein, of AIDS Healthcare Foundation, who decided that his method of STD control would be imposed upon a group of private citizens by force. Mr. MacFarlane was correct in his use of the word force to describe the government. The government is not the people. The government is the entity to which the people delegate the right to use physical force in the protection of the citizens. But when the government attempts to determine what is good for the people in matters that should be left up to their own free choice, it accomplishes the enforcement of its goals with the use of physical force. There is no government organization or program which does not carry at its base the threat of that if you do not comply, physical force will be used against you. That laws like Measure B can pass in the United States shows how little the people actually understand or appreciate freedom, but it also underscores the simple reality that the Icelandic porn ban and the widespread public acquiescence that will make it possible are not far off in our own country. The current left is gripped by the hallucinatory notion that they will be free if only they select the right kind of dictatorship, and Iceland is under the same delusion. We are a progressive, liberal society when it comes to nudity, to sexual relations, so our approach is not anti-sex but anti-violence. This is about children and gender equality, not about limiting free speech, Gunnarsdóttir told the Guardian newspaper. Well, you can spin it however you want, but all the benevolent motivations in the world won't change the fact that you are using government control to limit what information the populace can access. The straw man argument being widely touted is that this ban is not a ban on all erotic material, simply that which they determine to be violent or hateful. This is utterly absurd. That which is violent and hateful to one person can be acceptable and positive to another, and there is no person on the planet, government or civilian, that can determine what is proper to the existence of every other person or predict the reaction and response of every person. Gail's recent public bowel movement on the subject of BDSM is proof of that. But if the thought of having erotic material or any other means of expression pass through government hands for approval doesn't sound revolting enough, have a look at the documentary Heavy Metal in Baghdad. It tells the deeply moving story of Akrasakauda, Iraq's only metal band, and the trials they have to go through to do what most bands in first world countries do on a regular basis, like play a small show for a few friends. To accomplish that, the boys in the band have to apply to the Iraqi Ministry of the Arts for a permit, provide copies of their lyrics for review and approval, and play a certain number of songs praising Saddam Hussein. Also, none of them could have long hair. But hey, they did get to play the show, right? Well, mostly. The power to the building shut off due to a roving blackout. Following a series of greater and greater encroachments on their rights and safety, the band members flee the country. I'm sure there will be those who will want to say that such things wouldn't happen in Iceland. Surely Iceland wouldn't go to extremes such as that. After all, isn't Iceland a prosperous, progressive country with forward-thinking ideas and a vibrant intellectual community? Well, there was a time when Iraq was too. The pseudo-intellectual arguments being embraced in the support of this measure will sound all too familiar to my regular viewers. For example, when a 12-year-old, quote, when a 12-year-old types porn into Google, he or she is not going to find photos of naked women out on a country field, but very hardcore and brutal violence, close quote. Yes, that is verbatim Gail Dines, right down to the inevitable mention of a country field, but it's not coming from Gail Dines. That quote, according to the Christian Science Monitor, comes from Halla Gunnarsdóttir, political advisor to the Interior Minister. Or consider the words of Hildur Fjóla Antonsdóttir, a gender specialist at Iceland University. In speaking with The Guardian, she closes her tap dancing around the subject of censorship by saying, quote, otherwise we leave it to the porn industry to define our sexuality, and why would we want to do that, close quote. Even more Gail Dines propaganda abounds, even a return to the demonstrably untrue statistics saying that the average first age of viewing pornography is 11. Gail quietly backed off of using this statistic after Jesse Fisher provided outstanding evidence that it was incorrect at the Cambridge Porn.
It is a powerful form of sex education, with the average age of first viewing porn now down to 11 for boys. And let me tell you, this is not their father's Playboy.
Point of information,
No, rather than sporadic trips into a world
So
of...
I was going to start with an introduction, but because I wasn't allowed to give my point of information, I will just do it now. The statistic about children viewing pornography at the age of 11 came from a website called Top Internet Filter Review, which is run by a man named Jerry Repletto out of Huntsville, Utah. This is a false statistic which came from a man named Mark Castleman, who is a self-proclaimed former porn addict, and an author of a self-published book called The Drug of the New Millennium. When Seth Lubov in 2005 for Forbes magazine pressed this man about where the statistic came from, he said, I quote, "I don't remember where I got that from. That is a very common statistic. This number is made up and it came from nowhere, and it is evidence of Dine's either terrible research or very good cherry picking of data. The actual data for when people are introduced to porn or when they're seeking it out came from Kimberly Mitchell and Michelle Ybarra. Kimberly Mitchell is from Crimes Against Children Research Center. Michelle Ybarra is from the Internet Solutions for Kids. Out of a random sample survey of 1,500 kids aged 10 to 17, they found that they didn't start seeking out internet porn until the age of 14. At the age of 14, most people have started going through puberty, and this is a very common age to be sexually curious. So, now I will go on with my actual introduction. And don't worry, there's far more. I don't know if any of you have read her book, but I did a lot of work within sociology courses, and I graded a lot of papers, and I had to look at where people were getting their research. And I'm sorry, but Details magazine opinion pieces do not count as a citation source.
But now even that lie is resurfaced to feed the panting spaniel that is a government all too ready to swallow whatever tripe Gail throws at them. And that only further raises the question of how far the Icelandic government will actually carry this. After all, if they're ready to embrace the lies, factual inaccuracies, manipulations, and intellectual bullying that is Gail's stock in trade, do you really think that they're trustworthy enough not to carry out their newfound capacity for censorship to the extreme? And, predictably, the evidence being cited is fallacious at best. The Guardian writes, another study, I should clarify. Another, however, by Dr. Tim Jones, a psychologist at Worcester University, concluded, quote, the internet is fueling more extreme fantasies, and the danger is that they could be played out in real life, close quote. I'm going to go out on a limb and assume that citation came directly from Gail Dines because it is reflective of her consistent misrepresentation of her sources. The truth of the matter can be gleaned from the study itself, the abstract of which is easily available with a simple click on the link on the website, on the Guardian's website, or in my citations below. This abstract reads, quote, for James, his thoughts, sexual desires, impulses, and fantasies were objectified and reinforced by pornographic images and videos viewed on the internet, which were acted out in sexual contact with children. Thus, he was unrestrained in bringing his thinking, fantasizing, and visualization into the real world of sexual contact with children. The authors note that the proposed model drawn from James's case study does not suggest that every individual who has fantasies of unlawful or deviant sexual acts will inevitably act on them in the real world. For most who engage in such fantasies, they coexist with a conscience conditioned by societal norms, empathy, and histories of conditioned normative behaviors aimed at doing no harm to others in the real world of consensual, intimate sexual interactions. The danger comes when individuals like James with deviant sexual fantasies do not have a coexisting powerful reservoir of restraints based on social and genetic conditions that keep thinking from becoming doing. This study is in keeping with, close quote. This study is in keeping with the existing body of research done on pornography, and like those citations she draws from Neil Malamuth, This study does not reflect what Gail is claiming it does. This study comes to the conclusion that the problem in the matter lies with James and persons like him who have pre-existing mental disorders, not the effects of pornography itself. This is evidence to the complete contrary of what Iceland is proposing. It is a call for better mental health care to identify sociopathic and predatory individuals, not widespread censorship. Many have asked why I would waste my time providing lengthy, thorough intellectual responses to clowns like Gail Dines, Robert Jensen, Patrick Truman, Shelley Lubin, and the countless others, but the reason should now be readily apparent. When a first world country is threatening to invoke the Iron Curtain of censorship based on the cartoon parody of academia that these fools traffic in, it only validates the truth of my predictions. In my novel Eros Empire, I wrote of a world in which the U.S. government would use the good of the people as a justification to censor pornography, and because the people lack an understanding of exactly why professional sex is not just morally acceptable, but the very essence of human sexual freedom, the initiative to ban pornography goes unopposed, and soon a tidal wave of censorship engulfs the country. In Greek mythology, Cassandra was a daughter of Priam, king of Troy. She was granted the gift of prophecy by Apollo, but refusing his advances, was cursed so that her predictions would never be believed. I worry that I have fallen into that very mythology, knowing the truth with haunting accuracy and never being believed. In this desperate moment, in which a Western democracy threatens to take the first and most harrowing step towards the obliteration of freedom, I ask you, will you, whoever is within reach of my voice, still fail to see the writing on the wall? Will you still fail to realize that those who seek to control your sexuality and by extension your lives are not going to do so by declaring that you will not exercise the free and open use of your mind, but rather by teaching you to fear and distrust those that think you should? And now, at this late hour, will you still allow your rights to be taken away by those who are too chicken shit to live in a free society? You see now before you a simple and silent hand, one extended outwards, palm up and open, and it is asking that you hand over just one minute facet of your freedom. No, it will not ask for anything significant, only that you erase this one minor blemish on an otherwise spotless liberty. And if you give it that one tiny crumb, you won't notice the difference, just as you won't notice the difference the second time the hand visits, or the third, or the fourth, or the fifth. In fact, you will never notice because you will think every crumb you've handed over has expanded your freedom, not reduced it. After all, you don't use pornography anyway, so the ban doesn't affect you. The ban was supposed to stop pedophiles, rapists, and other sexual miscreants from having access to triggering stimuli. This shows that you care. You care about the children and women who have been raped, and you care about those shadowy bogeymen, the porn users, because you're depriving them of their addiction. Even when these crumbs are finally gone and there's nothing else for you to place in the simple and silent hand, you will still not realize what has happened because you will never be oppressed. You will fit snugly into the pocket of authority and never fall on the jagged razor edges that skewer and eviscerate those who try desperately to scramble to freedom. In the looming darkness of another wave of unchecked authoritarianism, the broadcaster Edward R. Murrow uttered the sign-off that would become his signature. The phrase is more than a memorable sign-off. It was a simple and solitary wish of human well-being as a looming tide of darkness enveloped a free country. Without any pretension of being on the level of Mr. Murrow, I wish to extend that same affirmation. Good night and good luck.